So I'm very pleased now to introduce this evening's speaker, Susannah Calderan. Susannah is an honorary research fellow in marine mammal ecology with particular interests in cetacean acoustics and in anthropogenic impacts on cetaceans, such as fisheries, bycatch, and underwater noise. Her work involves developing new visual and acoustic surveying and analytical techniques for localizing and tracking cetaceans at a range of spatial scales. She is a fellow of the Scottish Association for Marine Science, SAMS, and member of the SAMS CETRENS research group that provides advice and training on acoustic surveys and analysis. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand you over to Susannah. So as soon as you're ready, Susannah, if you want to share your screen.
Okay, can everyone see that all right and hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maria, and the other LNHS people, and thank you very much everybody who's come this evening to listen to my talk. I really appreciate that. I'm going to talk this evening a little bit about blue whales, which is one of my particular areas of research interest. As Maria said, I'm based on the west coast of Scotland at SAMS, the Scottish Association for Marine Science, which is near Oban. And I'm a whale researcher, and one of my particular interests is blue whales, particularly Antarctic blue whales, but also blue whales in various other places of the world. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit this evening about what we know about blue whales and mostly what we don't know about blue whales. So blue whales, I guess, are all about superlatives in terms of their size, in terms of how they have been exploited by industrial whaling until really quite recently, and in terms of the scales over which we study them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study them and the difficulties of that and how we're working on trying to iron out some of those difficulties. So you can't really talk about blue whales without talking about whaling and talking about the background to our current research, because whenever we're looking at any blue whale population in the world, we're looking at populations that are recovering from very, very heavy exploitation. So we're not looking at populations that are in, if you like, their natural state. Even though they've been recovering for some time, they're still very much depleted populations. And that's all the blue whales that we're looking at in the world. I'll look at the previous research that we've done and what we're doing now. So if you look at this blue whale here, this is an Antarctic blue whale. So they're the largest blue whales in the world. This is probably a female because it's so enormous. They get up to about, well, over 30 meters long, Antarctic blue whales. Northern Hemisphere blue whales tend to be a little bit smaller. They're primarily krill feeders. Blue whales are found throughout the world. And they were all whaling. Just an interesting point here, if you note, seeing this blue whale in the water, this is quite an interesting way of looking at blue whales, because if you see the blue whale, the part of the blue whale that's above the water, well, it's not blue at all, it's a kind of mottled grey kind of colour. But if you look at it through the water, the back end of the whale, you'll see it's this beautiful kind of luminous bright blue. And that's why they get called blue whales, because when you see them through the water, they are this beautiful blue. But above the water, they're this kind of not terribly inspiring kind of mottled grey colour. So in terms of blue whales as a species, so the species is Balanoptera musculus, its binomial name, but it's split into 4 subspecies. So there's Musculus musculus, which is North Atlantic and North Pacific blue whales, and they're the ones that if you were lucky enough to see a blue whale around the coasts of the UK and Ireland, they're what you'd see, that subspecies. Then there's Musculus intermedia, which are Antarctic blue whales, so the Southern Ocean blue whales. And then Cauda, which is slightly unhelpfully known as pygmy blue whales because they really aren't very small at all. but their tail stock is slightly smaller. And so they're pygmy blue whales, and they're found to a certain extent in the subantarctic, mostly in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Atlantic. And then there's indica, which is a slightly tricky subspecies because they're Northern Indian Ocean blue whales, but there's some discussion about whether they're actually part of Brevicauda subspecies. So the taxonomy of blue whales is slightly difficult, not least because we have really quite a small number of genetic samples from various different places in the world, so it's quite difficult. But my specialty is acoustics. So what I'm interested in is the sounds that whales and dolphins make underwater. And whales and dolphins use sound to navigate and communicate and find food. And all whales and dolphins use sound to some extent. And blue whales are particularly interesting because they have two types of sound. So they have what we call song calls, which are repeated stereotyped units of sound that they just repeat again and again and again. And then they also have these things called frequency modulated calls, which are sort of downsweep calls that, again, all populations of blue whales make. But the interesting thing about the song calls is whilst all blue whales make calls that are recognizable as blue whales, different populations in the world make song calls that are recognizably different. So whilst the taxonomy of blue whales is slightly difficult to resolve, it's quite straightforward to work out what acoustic population a particular blue whale is from. So at the moment, there's about, well, we're saying 14 at the moment, different acoustic populations of blue whales worldwide, but we keep finding more. But at the moment, it's about 14. And they're generally split between the high latitude blue whales, so sort of North Pacific, North Atlantic, Southern Ocean, which make very, very simple tonal calls. And then Pacific margin blue whales, like from Chile, California, that kind of area, which makes slightly more complicated calls. And then the long, complex cycles of the low latitude whales, so ones from Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand, that kind of thing. So this is what we've got in terms of blue whales of different acoustic populations throughout the world. So there's a couple here. This is the ones in the Northeast Pacific, and then a couple in the Southeast Pacific, and then the Southwest Pacific. And then the ones that we have around here, the Northeast Atlantic, Southern Ocean, and the ones that are found around Sri Lanka and the Northern Indian Ocean, and the Southeast Indian Ocean, around Australia, Southwest Indian Ocean. There's a couple of populations there. And there's a new population that has just been described in the Northwest Indian Ocean, which is acoustically different from other animals there. So it's quite interesting in that you can actually divide blue whales up into these populations by their different vocalizations. So just a little bit now about industrial whaling. Because as I said before, you can't really talk about blue whales without talking about industrial whaling, unfortunately. So prior to about 1900, there was a lot of whaling that happened in the world, but it was mostly coastal whaling from small boats. And there was a limit, well, with some notable exceptions, there was a limit to how much conservation and population impact whaling could have on whales, simply because it was hard to catch them. And they could only catch some of the slower, more coastal species, such as humpback whales and right whales. And obviously a lot of damage was done to those species, but it's a whole different order from what happened when industrial whaling came along in the early 1900s. So they had steam-powered capture ships, shore-based whaling stations, harpoons, and the big thing is that they could now catch the larger, faster whales, such as blue whales and fin whales, which they hadn't been able to catch before. And you'll see from these numbers here that the conservation impact on whales was absolutely devastating. And when one species started to decline, they started whaling on another species, and then another and another. And in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the number and the size of the whales caught started to decline quite dramatically, as you will be able to see here in the pictures. And well, I'll show you the next slide. But if you look at, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere, in less than 100 years, over 360,000 blue whales were killed. And of all the species in the Southern Hemisphere, in under 100 years, that was 2 million whales caught in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's absolutely extraordinary, the speed and efficiency with which most large whale species were wiped out, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. If you're particularly interested in this, the reference for these numbers is a Rocher et al. Paper, which is referenced down at the bottom of that slide. And it's particularly interesting and depressing, if that's the sort of thing you like. So if we look particularly at blue whale industrial catches, you'll see that things really hotted up in the 1920s and the 1930s. And vast numbers of blue whales were taken by industrial whaling during that time. An interesting little side to this is the numbers in yellow. Now, the International Whaling Commission, the IWC, was an organization that was put in place to manage whaling activities. And now it has somewhat more of a conservation role in some respects, but at the time it was literally about ensuring that the whaling industry could continue and could continue to be profitable. So that's why whaling was managed, not because they really loved whales. And in 1965, catching blue whales was banned simply because the numbers were just nosediving precipitously. And it's really just luck that blue whales didn't become extinct. There were very, very few left by the time that blue whaling was banned. But the interesting thing is you look at these figures in yellow and you'll say, oh, well, it looks like they were still catching blue whales. And that's because the Soviets carried on whaling illegally long after the ban. And the history of Soviet illegal whaling is also quite interesting because they falsified their logbooks, but they also kept genuine versions of the logbooks. So I don't really know why they did that. So we've been able to reconstruct the catches that happened illegally and that weren't declared after whaling was banned. So these numbers are kind of pretty extraordinary, and it's kind of quite hard to get your head around the number of whales that were killed so quickly, in such a short period of time. So these are a couple of interesting pictures. They are of one of the whaling stations in South Georgia. So South Georgia, as you probably all know, is an island in the Antarctic. And it was where shore-based whaling in the Southern Hemisphere first started. And the waters of South Georgia were absolutely heaving with whales when industrial whaling started there in 1904. And they had 7 shore-based whaling stations, and this is one of them. And these pictures were taken by a gentleman from the Isle of Mull who died not very long ago. And he worked as a whaler in South Georgia. And there's actually quite a history of Scottish whalers going and working in the Southern Hemisphere. And quite a lot of people worked at South Georgia who were originally from Scotland. And this is probably around 1960, we think. So towards the end of whaling at South Georgia, simply because they ran out of whales. And this is just one whaling station out of 7 towards the end of whaling. And just if you just look at the number of catcher boats, it's quite extraordinary. This is probably Leith. And so this was replicated in other whaling stations in South Georgia and then in other shore-based stations all around the Antarctic. So, it was quite the operation. So this is also South Georgia, and this is a blue whale. And it gives you the idea of the scale, how large blue whales are, also just of kind of the industrialization of killing that there was there. It's also an interesting picture because it was taken by Frank Hurley, who was the expedition photographer on Shackleton's expedition. So we can date it to 1914 because that's where the expedition passed through when Frank Hurley was there on their way down to the Antarctic. And And it was, you know, quite the industrial setup at South Georgia, and it must have been a horrendous place to be. The noise and the smell must have been awful. After shore-based whaling, pelagic whaling came along, so people were out at sea in factory ships. And if anything, that was even more devastating than shore-based whaling. And as you'll see from this quotation, that the factory ships had a much even larger capacity to catch whales than the shore-based stations. So I'm going to stop talking soon about horrible, depressing whaling. But just if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, you'll see how precipitous the decline in blue whale numbers in the Antarctic was between 1930 and 1965, especially from the 1920s and 30s, until basically the numbers flatlined. There were so very few left. And the figure on the right shows all those blue dots are the distribution of the catches. So you can see they had a pretty much a circumpolar distribution. So management of whaling had basically failed. The Antarctic blue whales survived just through pure luck, basically, and was well less than 1% of its original size by the time that whaling finished. You can see here, I'm going to talk in our next slide about some research surveys that were done where they were looking for blue whales using visual observers on ships. And it was done at this time where the red box is, and you can see how many whales they saw, very, very much diminished on where the catches had been during industrial whaling. So the research surveys where they had visual observers on board ships that I was just talking about are these. The International Whaling Commission ran the SOA cruises between 1978 and 2010. So for 32 years, every Antarctic summer, they went out on ships with trained observers and covered a huge amount of Antarctic water doing visual surveys for whales. As you can see from those numbers, thousands of miles and an awful lot of time of looking. And over that time, they saw 43,000 cetaceans, more or less. Out of those, they only saw 400 blue whales, well, 400 blue whale sightings. So that kind of tells us a couple of things. Firstly, that there were hardly any blue whales, and also that visual survey programs from ships where you're looking for a very small number of animals over a very big area aren't maybe the best way to try and come up with a population estimate, which is what they were trying to do. And it made us think about maybe there was a better way of trying to work out how many blue whales were left in the aftermath of whaling, and also whether those populations looked like they were recovering, which is what we really need to do now. So surveys, as I said previously, were done at the time of where that red box is, where numbers basically seem to be effectively flatlined. And those are the sightings in the figure on the right that they made during those surveys. And the population estimate was derived as being just over 2,000 animals at that point. And recovery was maybe at about 8%, but it was a bit of a question mark hanging over that. And so this was done at a time when whale populations were really, yet to start recovering. Now, the SOA cruises ended in 2010, and what we needed to think about is how we were going to look at blue whale recovery, how blue whales were doing without those massive ship-based surveys that took a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money and didn't necessarily really tell us much about how blue whales were doing. So a new research consortium, Southern Ocean Research Partnership, which was had a lot of Australian government, Australian Antarctic Division input, started to put together the Antarctic Blue Whale Project and the Acoustic Trends Project to look at blue whales and fin whales in the Southern Ocean. And the whole point of it was, can we develop new and efficient ways of studying blue whales and to find out if those populations are recovering? And that was basically what we were trying to do. So I joined this project in late 2011, and we started looking at how we could more efficiently survey blue whales. And all that stuff I was talking about acoustics earlier, this is where it comes in, because we decided that listening for whales by their vocalizations might be the most effective way of finding them. So the aim of the Antarctic Blue Whale Project was to derive an abundance estimate, so how many blue whales there are, by capture recapture, right? So that doesn't actually mean we actually caught the blue whales, which would have been like horrific and terrible. It's more that you sample a whale by photographing it or biopsying it, and you therefore know who that animal is as an individual, and then you know who that animal is again when you sample it on a subsequent occasion. So each individual blue whale is recognizable as an individual, both through its genetics by biopsy and also through its individual markings. So you can find that out through photo identification. So the idea was that we would throw acoustic recording devices into the sea to enable us to listen for blue whales and find out where they were from their sounds, then follow them, which we're able to do. I'll explain a bit more about these devices in a minute, then take photographs of them and biopsy them. So that was the aim of the program, and to find as many blue whales as possible so that we had as many captures and recaptures so that we could start to understand how large the population might be and whether it was recovering. So I'm just going to talk about diaphragm sonar buoys for a minute. So sonar buoys are underwater microphones. So they're hydrophones, and they both have a listening device, a hydrophone in them, and they also have a magnetic compass, so they can tell you where the sound is coming from, and they transmit by VHF. So they were formulated by the military to track submarines, and the military chuck hundreds of these out of helicopters and aeroplanes to listen for submarines. And we've repurposed them, ex-military, retired sonar buoys, to listen for whales instead. So the useful thing about them is that you can both hear whales and know what direction those whale calls are coming from. And that's the most important thing when you're tracking whales. So what is it about Antarctic blue whale calls and blue whale calls in general that make them so useful for tracking from long distances? So as I said before, most whales, all whales and dolphins make sounds, they vocalize, but their sounds are at different frequencies and at different source levels, so different volumes. And so some you can hear from a very long way away and some you can hear from not very far away at all. And the amazing thing about Antarctic blue whales is how far away you can hear them from, because they're both loud and they're very, very low frequency, which travels a very long distance in water. So as I said before, blue whales produce tonal or pulsed song calls, and that's probably only males that produce the song calls, but then they also make these downswept frequency modulated calls, which we think both sexes make, and all populations of blue whales do this. And their song calls are incredibly loud and they're very low frequency. And the whole point of that means that they go for such a long way through the ocean, especially with the propagation conditions in the Antarctic. So we can hear a calling blue whale from hundreds of miles away, hundreds of kilometers away. And so if we can both hear the whale and know where that call is coming from, we can track it from really quite a very long distance and find a whale or a group of whales, ideally a group of whales, because then you get more bang for your buck. Now I'm going to play some whale calls now. Now, the thing about blue whale calls is they're mostly all infrasonic, which means that they're too low for the human ear to hear. So when we're acoustically monitoring, we have our headphones on, but actually what we're looking at is a visual representation, spectrogram of the sound on a screen. So what I've done with these calls is I've sped them up so that you can hear them, but they're still quite quiet and quite low frequency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to whack the sound up on my computer now. And if you do the same on yours, then you might be able to hear them better. So firstly, I'm going to play the song call of Australian blue whales, and you can look at the scrolling spectrogram at the same time. And you'll see with those Australian calls, they're in several parts, and that sequence is just repeated again and again and again. So next, we're going to look at New Zealand blue whale calls. And then lastly, Antarctic blue whale calls. And you'll see that's a sort of Z. So that's the most loud bit, which is in red. And they just repeat those Zs again and again and again and again. That makes them very easy to track. Then I was talking about these frequency modulated calls that all populations make as well. Now, these aren't sped up because you can actually hear them, but they will sound very, very quiet, and they're much more variable. So that's the kind of thing that we're listening to when we're trying to track whales. And so we have software that we can get a fix on where the bearing is, and then we keep tracking these whales until we find them. Just talk to you a little bit more about photo identification as well. So what we're looking for when we're trying to identify blue whales to individuals is the distinctive mottling pattern on their flanks, which is different for every whale, and also the shape of their dorsal fin. So all these whales are all different Antarctic blue whales, and they're all individuals. And there's a catalogue of blue whale identifications, which is kept by sort, and there's 552 Antarctic blue whales in the catalogue at the moment. So this is quite interesting. This is a whale, the same whale that was seen 2 days apart in 10 days apart in 2006. And you can see it's got a really nice triangular marking of light mottling just forward of its dorsal fin. And that's a really nice, easy animal to photo identify. So what do we do when we're trying to find blue whales by acoustic tracking? So we throw a sonar buoy in the water, then we listen for whale calls, then we resolve the bearings that those calls are coming from, then we adjust our course according to where those sounds are coming from, and then we have visual observers on the boat to actually look out and find the whales. So it's quite a nice process, and often we will be following sounds for 36 hours, but we always find our whales. And these are just a couple of maps of detections of whales on a couple of voyages we did in 2013 and 2015, which were the first two that we did using this acoustic tracking technique. So we were quite nervous when we first started doing this because we didn't know if it would work. We didn't know if we would find our whales. We'd done a pilot study on the south coast of Australia, but that's a lot easier working there and the distances are a lot smaller. So we were very pleased that we did find a lot of whales, and on each of those expeditions on 2013 and 2015, we saw about 100 whales each just on those trips, which were a few weeks long, which if you think that the SOA cruises were going for 32 years and they saw 400 total, acoustics really helps us find whales because you can find them by listening to them. And so you'll see in those maps where you've got New Zealand at the top and the Antarctic continent at the bottom, that up around New Zealand, those blue squares are the vocalizations of New Zealand blue whales, and then they soon turn into detections of the red ones, which are Antarctic blue whales. And then those green dots are where we actually saw whales in various different aggregations that seem to be quite stable, which is probably about food availability. So after you've found blue whales, yes, you can photo identify them, you can do fine scale tracking, you can biopsy them. In that picture I've just put up, you can see there's a little drone in the top of the picture. You can fly a drone with a Petri dish and sample their below to look at the whale's microbiome. You can do CTD sampling of the water, look at krill that the whales eat with active echo sounders, and also do further studies on krill. So there's a lot of things you can do in terms of sampling the water that blue whales are in once you've found them. And as I said before, the Antarctic blue whale catalogue now contains over 550 blue whale individuals. Over 25% of those were found using acoustic tracking. And so we've now got a new superpopulation estimate of about 4,500 Antarctic blue whales, which, given the estimate that was done in after SOA with a growth of about 8%, that actually is about right, probably. But it's a superpopulation, so some of the animals that are in the catalogue might not still be alive. And we don't know that, you know, is it that we haven't found them or that they're not alive yet, not alive anymore. And the interesting thing is when animals have been sighted again, so the capture and then a recapture in different years, some of them you'll see from the distance column in the right hand side of the table, they've traveled a very, very short distance between resightings, but some of them have traveled enormous distances, and it seems to be about 50-50. They either go a really, really long way or really very short distances. And again, that's probably about food, and it's probably about what they've learned from their mothers in terms of where the good food supplies are. And you see this on this map as well. You see the red tracks are of whales that have moved a really long way away, and the blue tracks of ones that have hardly moved any distance at all. So we can find out quite a lot just from photographing animals. And I'm just going to circle back round to South Georgia that I was talking about earlier on in the talk. Now, blue whales were pretty much wiped out from South Georgia. They did a total job on them with industrial whaling. And if you look at the map on the left-hand side, the red dots are all the whales that were seen by both scientific sightings and by cruise ship sightings over the course of about 30 years, all of them. It's kind of basically nothing. Whereas if you look at the green dots, that's all the whales that we saw in one trip over like 3 weeks in 2020. So things are definitely getting better for blue whales at South Georgia, in that it does seem that they're coming back, even though it took an extremely long time for them to start coming back, probably because their numbers had been wiped out so low. If you look at the figure on the right, these are detections from sonar buoys, which we've also deployed around South Georgia, so the listening devices. And the yellow is what we heard in 2017, which is okay, we heard a few whales in a few places. The green is what we heard in 2018, so more. And you'll see that the red from 2020, we were hearing blue whales all around South Georgia. So there are signs that that whales are recovering after being really wiped out to an incredibly low level. And that's just a self-indulgent blue whale shot from South Georgia because, you know, it really is quite good news there that, that things may be improving. Now, closer to home, we do have blue whales in British and Irish waters, although they're mostly off the continental shelf break, and you would be very, very lucky to see one. I've never seen a blue whale in UK waters. The North Atlantic, it's the Northeast Atlantic blue whales that we're talking about that are around our waters, and they're mostly seen in Iceland, Biscay, and the Azores. But we have got no idea how many there are or really what they do. There's no agreed population estimate. They have been heard west of Scotland quite a bit because there was a military hydrophone array called SOSUS that was there in the 1990s, and it would track blue whales that were trucking up and down the shelf break, probably between the Azores and Iceland. And there was a whaling industry in Scotland, mostly from Shetland and from Harris in the Outer Hebrides. And this is where they were catching blue whales. So if you look on the left-hand picture, you'll see a load of dots right out west of the shelf break. And a similar picture if you look at the figure on the right, which was put together with IWC data by Conor Ryan, you can see that those hotspots in purple of where most blue whales were caught between 1904 and 1951 in Scottish waters. And if you look at the catches of blue whales in Scotland, out of Harris, they were actually catching significant numbers of blue whales, and certainly to the point where it was of detriment to the population. And probably one of the reasons we're seeing so few blue whales now, A, because they're miles offshore and it's difficult to see them, but also because the populations are probably still starting to recover even now. They're very long-lived, very slow to reproduce animals, so it's very easy to wipe out populations very quickly. Now, I said earlier that we find blue whales all over the world, and you saw that map very early on of the various populations that there are throughout the world of blue whales. And pretty much nobody is officially killing blue whales anymore. So whaling is no longer a threat to blue whales. In terms of lethal threats, the biggest threat to blue whales globally these days is ship strikes. So it's being hit by usually large, reasonably fast moving container ships. This is a picture from Sri Lanka, where there is a significant blue whale ship strike problem, which has been ongoing for some time because the blue whales in the main Indian Ocean shipping lane are in the same place. California also a problem, and Northeast Atlantic, Biscay, the Azores, St. Lawrence all have significant ship strike problems. Entanglement in fishing gear, mostly bottom set gear, creels, lobster pots is an issue. So in terms of lethal threats, those are the big ones. And then noise, so shipping noise and noise from seismic surveys are also very problematic. And obviously the overriding concern for all marine life is climate change. You know, blue whales are highly reliant on krill, and krill have very sensitive life cycles. They have to be at a certain point in the ocean at a certain time and a certain depth. And if they're not, then their life cycles can potentially break down. So climate change is kind of the big existential threat to all marine life. However, you know, there is a lot to be pleased about in terms of how blue whales are doing now, both in the Antarctic and closer to home and globally, in that they are no longer being killed in the way that they were in industrial whaling, and people generally have more respect for them than they did. And so, you know, somewhere like South Georgia is encouraging that if we stop killing whales, they can recover, even though it can take a really, really long time. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for listening. And if you've got any questions, I will, of course, be delighted to attempt to answer them, but probably tell you that we don't know the answer to that one. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susannah. That was very interesting. I think they're very disheartening to start off with. I think particularly the kind of scale of industrial whaling is really truly shocking, actually, when you kind of see the numbers.
Yes.
But positive to see, populations recovery, and and I think obviously the attitude towards whales generally, I think, is very different. There have been a lot of questions coming through the chat. So and yeah, if you'd like to put your videos back on, people can, and if people want to ask a question in person, we will probably have time to take a couple of questions, so do put your virtual hand up and we'll pick those up. But if we go over to you now, Anchor, and if you can pick up some of the questions from the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting and at parts depressing, and I think some people were quite astounded by the figures that you had to offer. There were actually just a range of different questions, so I'll just go through more or less as they came in, but I'll try to combine a few of them as well. So JK was asking, in terms of the acoustics, can the whales hear each other over those great distances?
Yes. Well, we assume they can, because we assume that with the males making those song calls that travel for a very, very long distance, that it's probably part of sexual mating behavior in some way. And yes, I'm sure they can hear each other across those extraordinary distances, which makes ocean noise, underwater noise, particularly problematic, because if they can't hear each other, it's really quite disruptive to essential life cycle parameters for them. So yes, I'm sure they can hear each other across those distances.
And then Hazel Pitwood had a kind of a song, a question that was related, and it's quite a longer one. So do blue whales, I guess, utilizing different acoustic calls, the 14 different ones, mate with animals from different acoustic groups, or are their acoustic calls different because they're essentially separate populations whose paths don't really cross? Presumably they could hear each other even if they're from different acoustic groups. So what about understanding each other?
Yeah, right. So mostly, of course, their paths don't cross. If you're a Northeast Atlantic blue whale, you're very unlikely to meet a Southeast Pacific blue whale. They tend not to cross the equator. Even migratory animals tend to stay in their own hemisphere. And so in general, they are separate populations, if you like. But then if you think about the blue whales that you're finding in the Indian Ocean, you could see in that image that I showed, they're all really quite close to each other relatively, and also the Australian and New Zealand populations, acoustic populations, are quite close to each other as well. So they will be able to hear each other. Whether they understand each other that's just completely beyond our acoustic knowledge at the moment, because we have no idea what they're saying. We think their sounds sound incredibly similar. As I say, these very stereotyped, repetitive calls, but that's literally because we don't understand very much about them at all. It might well be that they think they sound very different from each other. In terms of whether they mate with each other, well, probably yes, because then they're, like, for example, the ones Australian and New Zealand are the same subspecies. But again, that's right out with our knowledge about blue whales, which in many, many areas is very, very poor still. Very interesting question.
Yeah. There's another question that's kind of related again, and I'm just gonna find, oh, here we go, from Shruti, who was asking, can you please explain about frequency modulated calls?
Okay, frequency modulated just means that the frequency changes throughout the call. So those frequency modulated calls that I was playing, which are also known as D calls, they sound like like this. So it starts as quite a high frequency and then it goes down to a lower frequency, rather than those tonal calls that we were looking at with the song calls that tend to be a very, very similar frequency throughout a lot of the call. And then when there's a change, it's quite a dramatic change. Whereas the frequency modulated is just the call. You can have frequency modulated up calls, so or frequency modulated down calls. But it just means the frequency is changing constantly throughout the call.
Thanks. I particularly like the kind of reenacting the calls. That was particularly impressive. Just to remind if people do want to ask a question in person, we've probably got time to just take one or two, but I can see there's plenty in the chat, so please kind of carry on, Anchor, and pick some of the other talks out, the other questions out as well.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions on the sonobuoys as well. Ruth Bennett was asking if you could retrieve them afterwards, and Roger was asking, when counting using the sonobuoys, how do you avoid double or treble counting?
So the sonobuoys, the big downside with sonobuoys at the moment is that, well, they're not non-recoverable, they're recoverable, but usually we never go back to the same place. So if you think you drop a sonobuoy and then you start traveling to these huge distances to find whales and you drop another one or whatever, you're not going to go back to the same place. So we don't recover them. What we are working on is ones, so you can have reusable ones, but they're, again, kind of a pain because you still have to recover them. What we're hoping to do is use developing drone technology to be able to drop them temporarily and then pull them back in, and then the drone flies onto the vessel, that your survey vessel, so that the sonobuoy is never in the same place as the ship. That's the thing, because you drop it and move on. So we're hoping that that's going to be the future of them. Drone technology is not quite there yet, but that's what we're hoping for. Now, the other question about sonobuoys, double counting. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Is there any more
No
detail in the question?
No, there isn't. I don't know if Roger, if you want to raise your hand and ask and maybe explain a bit further. There he is. You can unmute yourself there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that if you're hearing a blue whale on a sonobuoy and you hear, how do you know you're not hearing the same one 2 or 3 days later if you're trying to do having to count them in the area?
Right, I understand. It doesn't matter. All we're trying to do is find as many blue whales as we possibly can. So if we find a blue whale and we photograph it and we biopsy it, and then we actually come across the same blue whale again, well, we'll be able to identify it's the same one that we've seen again because they are individually identifiable. And so it's not like a line transect survey. It's what we're trying to do is find as many whales as possible rather than make sure that we don't count the same animals twice. So it's got completely different survey rules to line transect surveys.
So you're not doing a population count?
Well, we're trying to estimate abundance, but we're doing it through mark recapture rather than through line transect.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Anchor, there's some more questions there.
There's
So
quite
yeah,
a few. We'll be sending
no,
them to you
I'll
in the
keep
end.
quiet. You carry on.
There was a question that was asked by somebody who wanted to know how long blue whales lived. And Maditha Kodakara wanted to know if the modeling pattern of an individual whale changes with age or if it's constant through life.
Right, so the easy one first, yes, the mottling pattern stays the same, which is why it's like our fingerprint. So once the animal has reached maturity, then apart from scars due to injuries or something like that, their natural patterning stays the same, which is why it is so useful to be able to photograph them, because that animal will always look the same throughout its life. And in terms of how old they are, we don't really know. There's been so limited studies on very large whales in terms of how old they are, and it's very difficult even to know what are reliable metrics for telling how old an animal is. I would expect many decades, and you know, in a natural circumstance where they're not subject to various human-based threats, many decades, but we can't really do very much better than that.
I think we have time for a few more. So there were some questions about the krill. And Hazel was wondering how well managed or sustainable krill fisheries are. And are they likely to become a threat, or are they already a threat? And Rajith was wondering what the impact on whales was of industrial krill harvesting.
Yeah, so I'm not a krill scientist. So I won't talk in this on very much detail because I don't have the necessary knowledge. The krill fisheries in the Antarctic are very well regulated by an organization called CCAMLR, and they do continue to calculate what is sustainable and what could be problematic in terms of there being competition with natural krill eaters, which in the Antarctic is kind of everybody, penguins, whales, seals, they all eat krill. So they're pretty well managed. On the other hand, all industrial fishing is potentially problematic. And we often don't know, if you circle back to when they were killing whales in the early 1900s, they had no idea what they were doing. Now, I'm not saying the krill fisheries are like that, but we often don't know till afterwards whether things have the impacts of fisheries. I think what's much more likely to be a long-term problem for krill and for krill eaters is climate change, in that industrial fishing can take out a certain biomass of krill, and it can be a significant biomass of krill. But if krill's life cycles are disrupted by climate change, then that's orders of magnitude more problematic than krill fisheries.
Thank you. And Anke, we've probably just got time for one more question from the chat. Can you pick out one last thing to finish on?
Yeah, there still quite a few interesting ones, but Ruth was wondering, do you know if blue whales have a mating heat run like humpback whales?
Again, we don't really know that much about what they do. That we know where a lot of blue whales are, especially Antarctic blue whales, we know where they are we divide whales up into breeding season and feeding season. And we say, the migratory whales, when they're at high latitudes during breeding season and at low latitudes, feeding at high latitudes during summer and breeding at low latitudes during winter. Now, that obviously doesn't work for populations such as Northern Indian Ocean blue whales, which don't really go anywhere very far at all. They stay pretty much where they are for pretty much all the year. But for the highly migratory blue whales, we sort of split it up like that. And I'm not sure that's very informative because, if it's breeding season, but there's something to eat, you're not going to say, oh no, I'm not going to eat because it's the wrong season. And likewise, we see a lot of behaviors in the summer, which should be feeding season. When we see a large group of blue whales interacting with each other, there's a lot of behaviors that really look like their mating behaviors. They're highly social, they're charging around, they're jumping about. We know a lot less about those kind of behaviors about blue whales than we do about humpbacks. So the answer is, don't know.
So we're going to need to round up the session now, but Susannah very kindly has said that any questions we didn't get to in the chat, we're going to send them to her and she's going to send us some answers, and we'll circulate that in a follow-up email. So you'll get an email to let you know about the recording. And also thank you very much, Susannah, for offering to do that, because I can see there are some quite interesting questions still that we didn't manage to get around to. So don't worry, everybody, we will make sure that we answer those questions as well.